Ostap Ukrainets is a Ukrainian writer and translator, author of historical fiction novels exploring imperialism in Ukraine's past. He is now a leading figure, a leading voice as well in the Cultural Forces Battalion of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And today we are going to be not just doing the Ukrainian Advent, where we look at some sort of books and films. So hang on to the end of the interview because we are going to do that. During this conversation, we're also going to talk about writers who disseminate narratives that may or may not be beneficial to the Kremlin and examine their motives for doing so. And again, before we jump into this, thanks to everybody who is supporting the channel. Make sure you like, subscribed, etc., so you don't miss any episodes. And also to say that this project, this Ukrainian Advent project, is very kindly supported by the makers of the film The Steel Porcupine. And again, wait to the end of this episode and you'll be able to see a little promo for that. I highly recommend that you watch that film. It is incredibly impactful and instructive. Ostap, welcome back.
Nice to be back here with you.
It's a tremendous pleasure. Not such a pleasure, though, to talk about the works of this particular individual, and that is Anastasia Piliavsky, who is, I believe, a journalist. She describes herself, has written a number of articles. Two in particular feature in The Spectator, which is a sort of analytical commentary magazine in the UK. It is a little bit sort of, I would say, right-leaning, not extreme right. It's not a sort of Bannon-style publication, but it is right of centre in terms of its political positioning. There's two articles. Now, how did you come across these, and how did they strike you when you first read them?
I would say that the article Ukraine's war on Russian language was a mistake, or something along these lines it is called. It just popped up in my Facebook feed with the post being a question: who the hell is Anastasia Pilavsky? And she is speaking for the Ukrainians, and yet her voice is non-existent in Ukraine. We've never heard of her. Why is she speaking on our behalf? That was the sentiment I primarily started reading the article. I recognized the pattern. Obviously, I did because Anastasia is not the first one to follow that pattern. And after that, I just said, well, too bad background checks are sometimes not a thing when deciding if a person is qualified to speak on behalf on some kind of society. I mean, it would be weird if I wrote to Spectator about any society I have some kind of distant understanding of, despite living there for some time, like Poland, let's say. I would say my connection to Poland is quite similar to the one Anastasia shares with Ukraine, and that, well, I would not allow myself to talk of Poland in any kind of expert capacity, despite the fact that I know the inner workings of Polish state and society pretty well. I just am not the part of that society functionally. You know, it's same as saying many of my friends are, well, Polish, Ukrainian, gay, Jewish, no matter what kind of bigotry you want to defend with this kind of, I have a connection to the topic. The topic is ill-informed in itself. I would say it is targeted on Western audience who lack proper context. And in this, it is pretty similar to what, say, Marta Havryshka does. She is infamous in Ukraine after all
Oh,
these
I've
years.
I've
Marta, I mean, she
I
is
followed her for a
infamous
while,
because of
but
all the, uh, uh, well, plainly said lies she was
hmm.
spreading, especially in latest years, because she started off as an okay researcher, and then it all went downwards from that point. I never heard of Anastasia before I read that first article. And so I wouldn't say that the introduction was all that complimentary, and I liked the way I was introduced for the person. So I am biased. I should say it right away. I am biased because I recognize the pattern along which the material works. and that comes with its own baggage of materials of the kind I read before, and people who wrote that materials and their historical connections with Russia, etc. It's hard not to be biased when you see the same old point regurgitated for the tenth time, and by a person claiming to be Ukrainian insider, no less, while not living in Ukraine.
And actually, this isn't her area of expertise. She teaches at King's College London, it says, but she is more closely affiliated with King's outpost or affiliate in India. And it seems that anthropology, sociology, anthropology and political analysis of the Indian subcontinent is actually her area of expertise. So I find it kind of quite curious, actually. And this is a repeating pattern, as you say, where people who are not necessarily well known or actually known at all in the journalistic field in Ukraine or necessarily are Ukrainians. Often they'll be Russian or tangentially associated with Russia and its allies. They are asked to pronounce on what are very delicate issues. And they seem to have an extraordinarily strong opinion about them. This is a repeated pattern, and the Spectator is guilty of it numerous times. And actually, both her articles would seem to do this. One focuses on so-called targeting of Russian-linked culture or imperial culture in Odessa, and the other article focuses on apparent victimization of Russian as a language. There's a real pattern here, isn't there?
I mean, that is a pattern that is easy to recognize, and the mention of Odessa only adds to the roster of problems, as Odessa is to put it lightly, a contested region, ideologically, culturally, socially. After all, our last meeting was in Odessa, where you came to talk on the Ukrainian festival in Odessa about cultural contexts of Ukrainian South, and we touched upon the topic of um, Odessa being not an easy conversation even within Ukraine. I would say that for a foreigner trying to understand social linguistic dynamics of Ukraine, looking through a lens of Odessa as presented by a non-Ukrainian person is one of the most twisted images of what is actually going on one can receive, which is a problem because Odessa is a famous city and it is culturally famous city, and many of the culture it is famous for comes in Russian language. It comes from Russian-speaking times, and of course, a seaside city, a huge resort people used to come to and move to because of the climate, because of the it is just nice living there, would spawn a great lot of imperial culture in the first place because, well, it is a center of gravity in the empire. It is a huge port city. It is a huge resort. It is a place that would flourish culture in any scenario, as huge seaside cities often tend to. So the fact that Odessa became a sort of one of the cultural capitals in the Russian Empire is not nothing to be surprised of. It's simply the question is not about that part of Odessa's heritage or culture at all. It is about Odessa finding its image in modern day Ukraine, which is something completely different. But for the way Russian culture works, it is not, because Russian culture, especially nowadays, since the war began, is predominantly focused on the past, on the glory of the past, on those bright and glorious pages the world knows them for. And so no future is to be created within that cultural framework. Only the past is there to be glorified, to be remembered. And that's why when we start to rethink or just, well, make critical inquiries into how this cultural landscape actually works and what part of it is actually something that needs preservation or perhaps some shout out, etc. And what is the part state should not bother spending resources on. Once you try to engage into this kind of conversation, you realize there's none to be had more often than not, because you are simply not allowed to revise the past in any capacity under this Russian culture umbrella.
I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by The Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Butcher massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
And she seems to have two particular words. Now, she uses an S word repeatedly. I can't say it here because it turns out that this is a great tool for trolls to come and block your videos. If you use the word that describes someone, ending their own existence, it turns out that the videos get blocked.
Yeah,
So we
but
won't use that word. But
I laugh at this censorship. It is
yeah,
it is freaking awesome to see people put in asterisks in words that you will get banned, like in Russia for, like
yes.
the World War, which is, I guess, not allowed to say right now. But okay, that was tangential. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
And that's right. No, I can't use the S word, but we all know what I mean here
Yep.
to end one's existence. And of course, it turns out the Russian trolls are on the lookout for this, so they will report actively channels where it's mentioned in a video. So I don't want to give them the opportunity to do that. But she does use that word a lot, and she uses it in the context describing decolonization as a process that would destroy Ukraine, destroy its unanimity, and especially in the context of war, which strikes me as absolutely bizarre. And then she also uses that in the context of Russian language itself, saying that somehow to sort of force it out of education, to force it out of civic administration. She talks about it almost as a top-down process of turning Russian into a pariah language, But that's not my experience. It's more bottom up here that people are choosing not to speak it on an individual basis because it's painful for them. But she describes this, what she says is a war on the Russian language as a process that would destroy Ukrainian statehood. I find these ideas utterly bizarre. How do they strike you?
They strike me as the same way they always do, that pro-Russian liberals turn ultra-conservative as soon as they have to face their own imperial prejudice. And that is striking. That person who will, well, according to not non-contextual examples or examples from far away. When analyzing some far away or long ago culture, the person might hold pretty all right opinions on what is going on and how dynamics of power and how submission works in the imperial dynamics. As soon as that view must become introspective and analyze one's own relations to the imperial culture, the person becomes a staunch conservative, believing that everything that empire brings is good, and the argument of the British bringing culture to the people they colonized, the person would laugh at such a concept, and then we will talk about Soviet Union, and the person will say, well, but would you have all the power plants? Would you have all the schools without Soviet Union? Which is basically same argument, just for the another part of world geography. And I believe that is what's going on here for the most part. Because have you ever heard that Ukraine is a failed state?
I've heard that Russia wants it to be one and has energetically tried to turn it into one for the last 2 decades, but it is not, in my view,
Well,
a failed
I
state.
mean,
Yes.
the messaging itself, the framing of Ukraine as a failed state, and the presentation of any real problem that Ukraine actually faces as a symptom of it being a failed state. That is a kind of paradigm Russia's been employing for last, I would say, 20 years, because that is as far as I can remember that. But I would not actually be surprised if that started right after Soviet Union collapse. So Ukraine is to be presented as a state entity that cannot make it on its own, that will delve into chaos if left unchecked. That
That
was the
Ukrainians are
basic.
incapable of self-governance. That's certainly
Yep,
a
that was
narrative they use. Yeah.
the basic premise for the Budapest Memorandum, one of those, and that is kind of a scary story Russia is telling its Western adversaries to scare them into not letting Russia collapse. Because once Russia collapses, all those local wars will ignite, well, not for some reason, but because all those peoples Russia colonizes are fundamentally incapable of self-governance. They cannot be trusted with any kind of sovereignty. And since Russia believes Ukraine to be a part of Russia, that same logic applies to Ukraine, despite Ukraine having its independence. And the the idea that Anastasia is building upon when writing everything she is writing boils down to Ukraine being a failed state. Because this kind of rhetoric about Ukraine ending its own existence by enacting policies Ukraine believes are in order right now, that is kind of logic that Russia builds upon. So whatever Ukraine does, which is not anti-Russia, I would say, which does not take Russia into account, which any policy that acts as if it's not Russian fucking business, what the hell are we doing here in Ukraine? Whenever that happens, that policy is presented in Russian media and in pro-Russian media across the globe as something that is actively harming Ukraine, which is a self-harm, and moreover, it's a dangerous self-harm that actual people, whether in Ukraine or abroad, can suffer from. from. That is not just a simple piece of propaganda. This is a way of thinking about Ukraine that Russia artificially created and boosted through the years. And I would say Odessa and Crimea are two focal points of this idea. They were considered in Russia itself primary grounds for such ideas to spread from. They successfully did that in Crimea, and they miscalculated horribly in Odessa, but they are still in for it. They are still using a pro-Russian Odessa-born citizen living abroad to promote Russian image of Odessa and Russian names associated with Odessa. And that is part of a huge problem our Ministry of Culture is facing right now. In general, everyone who has something to do with Ukraine, because Russia is more aggressive than it was before, using the concept of Ukrainian South and the image of Odessa and the image of suffering it inflicts. It creates an image of suffering, which then empowers the message about Ukraine making those people suffer through social and humanity policies, while the suffering itself comes from the warfare, of course.
And there's something curiously, dare I say it, Russian about the whole implication in the article. She uses lots of terminology, lots of legalistic terminology about open, pluralistic societies, rule of law oriented, etc. That's I would say that's the sort of linguistic structure of it, but the tone seems to portray something different, and that is a certain hubris, a certain, I would say, annoyance or anger at the Ukrainian state impinging on what she would think, I think, is her privilege. It's her privilege to speak Russian wherever she wants. It's her privilege to consume Russian culture. It's her privilege to read whatever literature she likes, etc. And she's conflating these individual privileges with a societal right, and then using very legalistic language to try and turn that into something more formal. As I know you do, if you study Putin and his regime, and actually some of the Russian opposition will do this as well. They mix up individual privilege and turn them and conflate them with kind of universal rights, and they also use hollow legalistic language to give themselves authority when really what they're defending is their own individual motives and hubris. Have I gone too far there, or do you see something in that?
I would say that is a really precise point of view at how it all acts. It just I don't I don't think I ever saw a phrase status quo ever used in her articles, and that part of the conversation addressed in general, because you cannot discuss societal problems without discussing status quo. But before that comes into play, um, I would say I forgot what I wanted to say
That's
here.
okay.
Doesn't matter. I mean, she does not address the uh before the status quo comes into play, uh about the privilege of consuming Russian culture and speaking Russian language. The point is here, and almost every time it is mentioned, the point is no one is taking away the privilege. No one is banning Russian language or Russian culture, well, the Russian made content is being banned, but that is to be expected because, well, you wouldn't pay money to Russia right now. And that kind of ban just makes sense both legally and pragmatically. Otherwise, if you can access it, or if you already possess some kind of cultural product like books, movies, etc., no one is stopping you. The whole point is state is just not paying for your privilege. If you want to be privileged, well, that is on you. I would pretty much would love to have a personal driver, a chauffeur. Well, state would not pay for that, unfortunately. But I do not blame the state. I blame myself for not being able to afford. And that is not the perfect example because language is not actively supported, but it is still not banned at all in any capacity. There is no prohibition of Russian language. And then when it comes to status quo, I would say, of course, we all know that loss of privilege feels like an oppression for many people. It is to be expected, but what I wanted to talk here is not even Ukrainian language. What I wanted to talk here is Crimean Tatar language, and to pose a really obvious for any person living in Ukraine question: where do you go from there? What is the logical step of dealing with Russian if you cannot decolonize its effects? So, um, let's say there's a name Mariam, which is normal for a Crimean Tatar, a Turkish girl, or many Turk and Muslim in general countries. The name is just okay. It's just normal. It's still Masha in Russian. Russian language, and it is a huge problem, does not recognize proper names. If you accept Russian as a language of your culture, you must assimilate wholeheartedly. There is no place for your name. There is more likely than not no place for a city or town of yours, as Russia will rename it, will call it its own, and nowhere it is seen better than in Crimea, where many native names were just renamed into Russian, not Ukrainian, because Ukrainians don't give a hell about Tatars naming their own villages. That is the way it is supposed to be, and and that is kind of the point of all this. That is the question we must answer before talking about any kind of repressions or whatnot. If we are not allowed to touch Russian language in any capacity whatsoever, where do we move from this place? I mean, we've been renamed. Our cities have been renamed. Is, according to Anastasia and other people making this argument, is it the correct answer to just accept the fact that you have been assimilated because you are better than this? Just say, well, I guess I'm Russian now because that's what I was told, and to act otherwise would be toxic. It would be aggression against Russians who have assimilated me. I guess I must be a Russian now. And that is what many people actually do. That is a way of thinking many people would accept, especially now on occupied territories, because if you do not accept that being under Russian occupation, you will be killed more often than not. You will be dispossessed. Your apartment, your house, your car will be taken away. You are at risk of that. And the risks are manifold. You will be not provided any state support like healthcare or whatever if you not accept Russian passport, and accepting Russian passport means assimilating because they will write you down in the passport according to how they see fit. And so after this all ends, after the Soviet Union, because that is the background we are discussing here, after the Soviet Union, people like Anastasia would have us do just that. Say, I guess we are Russians now, and simply accept the assimilation, because doing otherwise would be making unnecessary fuss, being too quarrelsome, being too aggressive for our own good, being too unstable, and being regarded as a failed state in the end, because that thesis of a failed state basically comes from Russia framing all the anti-colonial policies in Ukraine. It is for them any successful issue of anti-colonial practices in Ukraine is a symptom of Ukraine becoming a failed state, because in Russian concept of the world, no Ukrainian state can exist outside of Russian Federation, not because it simply cannot exist, but because if it exists outside of Russian Federation, that must not be a state. That is their logic. And they are not alone in thinking along those lines or misquoting Dick Cheney. If American soldier does that, that is not torture. And that is same kind of logic that Russia applies to justify its claims for neighboring countries, not just Ukraine. It applies really to any country neighboring Russia or still being occupied by Russia. Just the content of this template would vary depending on the country.
And there's a built-in assumption here as well, isn't it, that Russian culture has a primacy, that under no circumstances can visual and written arts in Ukrainian by Ukrainian and which have to Ukrainian a character ever be considered on the same level as Russia. There's almost inbuilt, I would say, sort of cultural hubris into many of the arguments she seems to be making.
I mean, that is their understanding of the concept of sovereignty. As Russia is a sovereign state, Russian culture is a sovereign culture with which uh, is basically thus protected from any kind of anti-colonial point of view, because it is simply neutral. Culture, culture is has nothing to do with politics. Culture is a neutral part of everything there is to Russia. Russia can be bad politically, Russia can be bad socially, Russia cannot be bad culturally, because culture cannot be bad. I mean, what do you even mean? What do you mean culture being a negative force? What do you mean a state being aggressive through culture? Culture does not work like that. And because Russia protects this stance, all while using culture as a weapon all the time, the baseline assumption for a person interacting with Russian culture and interacting with criticism of Russian culture is that, well, the criticism is an act of aggression, because Russia has real power on the ground wherever it influences. I mean, its close neighbors. They have the influence. They have newspapers bought and TV channels bought, that used to be in Ukraine prior to 2014. They have the capabilities to create the informational space around you right here, and they have the capabilities to present your point of view, that's Ukrainian point of view in this case, as a marginalized. And for a modern audience, unfortunately, marginalized already almost always means radical. All those groups that will go just throwing soup on Mona Lisa and blowing city in Palmyra, and all those vandalisms against culture in different ways, from ISIS to radical, or as I call them, stupid left. All that spectrum of using culture as a medium to drive home a political message, which people really do not like, because, of course, they don't. And add to that modern day conspiracy of wokeism, and any critical approach towards a culture, especially when it is protected by a label of great culture, is simply disregarded as either vandalism or wokeism. And the society that engages in either is simply not worth the attention. It's just vandalism for those who will believe the story of vandals, and wokeism for, Trump and company, Orban, Fico, and people like that, who will be selling that kind of narrative of Ukraine as aggressively not anti-colonial, like defensive, but anti-Russian offensive policies.
And the last question on this before we get on to the sort of cultural preferences and the fun part of the conversation, there's this interesting phrase in here. And of course, in her framing, she's saying this is a really bad thing. But I think it's a brilliant phrase on how you should actually treat Russian. She says that an atmosphere is being created where Russian is treated like a controlled substance. That's her phrasing. I actually think that Russian should be treated like a controlled substance because whereas the language isn't intrinsically toxic, it isn't intrinsically evil, it is, however, used by Russian imperialists as a tool of warfare, as a tool of coercion, as a tool of mind control. And the literature is weaponized and the culture is weaponized too. So actually, we should treat Russian like a controlled substance, perhaps, wearing these, special gloves, etc.
I would say that I'm not sure if she has, I suppose she does not, any education as a linguist, and it shows because what she does and what many people talking about question of language in Ukraine do is conflate two notions of language. Because when we talk about Russian language, we more often than not mean Russian language as a principle. You know, practical realization of all the potentialities that Russian language holds. To translate it into Schopenhauer's example of how the language works, the language itself is a game of chess. All the rules and all the possibilities contained within. But the speech act, what we mean pragmatically by language when discussing these topics, is a specific game of chess, a specific set played between two players, a specific kind of conversation which has its own intentionality. Language as a concept is devoid of any intentionality. That's why I say time and time again that no one is waging war on Russian in Ukraine, and Russian is in no way prohibited because Russian language as a principle is nowhere near prohibited, nor its use. It is not supported. If it is in any official capacity, it must come with Ukrainian translation, which is, I believe, pretty sane and sound expectation while living in Ukraine, to have any piece of information translated into Ukrainian and then it can be in whatever language, which is, not an act of aggression as well. But where it comes into play when we start analyzing specific speech acts and specific frames of communication, be those books, ballet, whatever, any kind of culture is a type of communication, is a type of translating some kind of information, some kind of message, some kind of experience. And more often than not, there is no problem with the message itself. There is problem with the context of that message, of the context within which the message is being translated. Like, for example, famous Russian movie "Ирония судьбы" или "С легким паром", which every household used to watch in the New Year Eve in Ukraine as
Without
well.
fail, yes, absolutely.
And so, is it prohibited? And I'm not sure if it is banned, it shouldn't be. But, well, we have a list of banned media which simply provide Russian propaganda, but those are mostly war movies, etc. Those misrepresenting historical reality, or specifically Ukrainians and other nations like Latvians. Russians have a bunch of those.
But this is really
But
interesting, Ostap, because there are many people I've spoken to who now say, well, we watched Brat and we watched Brat 2, and we sort of just took them as entertainment. And then we rewatched them in the context of war. And suddenly, all this subtext, all this manipulation in those come through. So maybe there's a reassessment, actually, quite a healthy assessment of rewatching some of these materials and actually seeing, a fairly toxic culture or toxic intent embedded within some of these Russian cultural products.
I would hope for such reassessment. I would love to say that because I came through my own reassessment. I had a much more positive view on Russian culture, which was not changed by the media, which was not changed by the news, which was changed by my honest attempt to review all the Russian culture I knew after the 2014. But why I mentioned Ironia Судьбы? Because while there is nothing problematic with the film in general, I would say the message is shit and really non-reliable, non-relatable for Ukrainians. But still, nothing wrong with the movie as a whole except for the context, except for the medium, except for the fact that playing this movie time and time again each year on the New Year Eve, we simply rob ourselves of airtime for any kind of sane Ukrainian Christmas content, which cannot simply appear because this kind of niche is already occupied by a half a century old Soviet shit. And that is the problem we are facing. The problem is oftentimes not with the creation itself, but with the aggression the state and NGOs that were paid by Russians tried to force this kind of entertainment down your throat, aggressively prohibiting sometimes Ukrainian content from even appearing. I made the example of Russians changing names, not just names of Ukrainian children, but names of Tatar children, which are vastly different from Russian names. But that goes deeper than that because I'm familiar with this kind of world since I'm 11. I was a child star on a Russian television program, which was actually the adaptation of British. I guess The Brainest, it was called in Britain, this show.
Oh, Brain of Britain or something like that. Like a
Something like
kids
about
quiz show.
who is the smartest kid in the room, you
Smartest
know.
kid, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we had the version of that show made for Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. And then for a season, Kazakhstan was always there, but then they skipped and never made it back. So I've participated since I was 11 till I was 17, and I have a nice inside view of how Russian media worked at the time. And my mother was a musical journalist, so she had to deal with many international, as we would call them back in the day, stars, popular both in Ukraine and Russia. And so the example I love using because it shows why you need to engage in such a critical prohibiting of Russian is a singer with goes by an alias Mika Newton. She is from Burштyn, which is a small town in my region. I would say it is also a really depressed town because the only entertainment they have is a huge power plant, and that is now bombed to rubble during last year, so no entertainment left. But Mika Newton was the one to migrate to Moscow and to become a star in Russia, so she hit it big. Her songs became OSTs for Russian primetime TV shows and whatnot. And then she came back for some kind of musical festivals, and my mother was trying to interview her. And the producer, she told her, has prohibited her from speaking Ukrainian because it is bad for the image. You could have been prohibited from speaking Ukrainian in Ukraine because it is bad for the image, and that was the doing of Russian state. And to say that now dealing with the aftermath of all this clusterfuck, beg your pardon, and trying to create more understanding infrastructure in culture, trying to create opportunity-based infrastructure, not the two producer centers that just decide what will you watch today. That is called ending its own existence for Ukraine in this case. And so when you're reading such a material from Ukraine, you cannot help but laugh at it, at how ill-informed It is, and how the authors seem not to grasp contemporary Ukrainian society in the slightest. But when you are reading that from abroad, I suppose, and it hits all those recognizable markers of talking about Russian culture, and then fill in the gaps with whatever narratives they want to spin this time, it is easy to believe. I get it is easy to believe, and I even find it really hard to be angry at all the foreigners who might believe this kind of shit because uh, it's not like we are doing really good job informing them, you know? It takes a lot of resources to do that. And well, Russia just can allow itself spend this kind of resources just to force home the narrative it wants to force home. And right now, as the negotiations about the negotiations are being rumored of once again, the question of language will be forced, and it will be forced hard on Russian part, because that's what they do all the time. That is, in their opinion, one of the key ways to discredit Ukraine internationally, to show the Ukraine as the imperialist aggressor. And I use the Ukraine here deliberately because that is their meaning. To show that on its own, Ukraine cannot help itself. It must be assimilated and incorporated into Russia to become safe again for its own people and for its own good. And that's why I suspect, because I have no proof of that, but I suspect that every single time I read the material like that, that Russia is behind this material being made in some capacity. I'm not saying Anastasia is Russian agent. I just say that being paid for politically sensitive pieces in sensitive times is not something Russia is above of, and something they do pretty often, and we know for a fact they do. They can offer and force such materials to appear. We know that because they have done it before. And now, as this the timing of this piece coincides with all the outside pressure Ukraine is facing in I'm not sure what kind of round of negotiations that is, but with all the international pressure, I don't believe that article was written in good faith, not in the slightest, unfortunately. I would love to engage in some kind of discussion with the opposing view. I simply do not believe that I can meet a Russian or pro-Russian Ukraine-born person. I would be able to have such a conversation. Some foreigner, perhaps yes, not anyone who has a political agenda deeply ingrained as she does.
I was going to, in several of her online profiles, she spells Odessa with a double S, which is a clear indicator of, I would say, unreconstructed imperial view of things. I wonder if she calls it the Ukraine as well. And she's misspelt the word Cambridge, which she's supposed to be a fellow at, in her LinkedIn profile. So there's some, the usual interesting stuff kind of going on here with her profile as well. I mean, it's a question as well of not just her writing this, but of course it's commissioned. There's an editorial decision to publish it, and as you say, at a particular time. It just also coincides with a lot of articles by someone who's actually been on my channel, who I've met several times in real life. He is exceptionally sort of polite and personable individual in real life, but he has written a lot of articles with some fairly poorly researched sources, and some sources which are listed as being highly credible. And then you ask Ukrainians and say, no, that's not really a credible individual. But it's Aaron Matthews who's written a number of what I call hatchet jobs on Zelensky, a whole slew of articles through this peace process, basically talking down Zelensky, talking down his government, talking him down personally, and making some fairly outlandish claims, and really basically talking to some, oppositionists who are not particularly credible political figures, and then elevating them. So there seems to be an editorial choice to run these stories as well.
I would say that, well, this guy I totally remember, but I forget his name all the time. The guy who every time crisis hits, he writes something on Ukraine,
Mm.
and it is somehow always on how it is bad and we should be ended. Well, he's just Walter Duranty of our age. I mean, I struggle to believe that a foreign person would care this much about Ukraine being just an emotional or personal bind and his love for the truth about our country and our society being uncovered to help us all. I just find it hard to believe, you know.
Mm.
And knowing how Russia operates internationally and knowing that they do in fact invest serious amounts of money into making particular topics more underlined, making particular topics even appear in the informational space. I would not be surprised to learn any of people we mentioned today are on Russian payroll in one way or another. And by Russian payroll, I mean a wide variety of things, because a person can be on Russian payroll and do not know that and just not know that at all, because when we were studying how Russians work in publishing market, I'm not sure how that corresponds with media market internationally, but I would suspect that some things are similar. And so the way they work, by a really unimaginably wide network of bookstores and publishing houses all around Europe, which will really often be international entities legally. And then you check them, you do the background check, and somehow it all ties back down to some kind of Rostov or Ryazan, or rarely Moscow. And the owners turn out to be the same as same kind of business in Moscow or in Rostov or whatever. I would suspect that is kind of how they operate internationally via media. They totally have their shells abroad, people who are on Russian payroll, who may not be that public themselves, who may not be public authors, but who may be managers and who may be in the position of the power, who may be well reputed to be in such a position, to just help out with that, because that is how that is how international intelligence works. I mean, living in 21st century in year 2025 and believe that Russia is not engaging in a large scale intelligence work against all the Europe and UK included right here, right now, using all the assets it can use, is either a naivete or just, that is something you want to happen. I have no other explanation for
And
this.
academia, even more so, probably those networks that were built during the Soviet period never quite went away. I rather suspect there are certain networks within the film industry, within, grant applications for films, academic projects, even distribution networks that will have very strange little dotted lines to finance that can veto certain projects and certain narratives and can elevate others which are, loosely
Regarding
Kremlin aligned.
distribution
Yeah.
rights, I don't know about rest of those you listed, but
Mm.
regarding distribution rights, you are in fact right, because not only we know that it still is in place nowadays, but in book market, for example, for decades, Ukrainian players were not able to buy rights for international titles, especially if those were international bestsellers, because Russia would just monopolize the copyright market for the former Soviet Union. And so what you must do, you must go to Russian agent to buy that rights from them and pay Russians. But more than that, it meant, as it used to be during the Soviet times, that no Ukrainian translation can appear before a Russian one appears. And unless the book is translated into Russian, it cannot appear in Ukrainian. That was totally legal, because that was just business. That was just how everyone used to do business during the Soviet times, when Russians more often than not did not pay for rights anyway. But still, that used to be the problem. That used to be the reason why many franchises, many book cycles never appeared in Ukrainian up until the war began, and we managed to break this lobby because it was immensely powerful. It controlled the book market for our region, and war was the only thing that helped break its back. And once that happened, once Russian dumping of low-priced books on Ukrainian market was, well, ceased to exist, it turned out that it is really not profitable to print Russian books in Ukraine. It just it is not prohibited in any capacity. I mean, you can do that. It just almost no one does, because you won't sell them, because no one will buy them.
You won't
And
make your money back.
that
Yeah.
is that is so hilarious. I mean, the only reason that system existed because Russia had a practical monopoly on that market. And once the monopoly was broken, it turned out not only they are not the dominant player, they are no player at all. Monopoly and official backing was the only thing that held them together. And that works for Russia in so many other spheres, I believe.
That's very telling, it really is. And on that note, we are going to turn to Ukrainian culture and identity. So I'm going to ask you at this point of the conversation to nominate your most impactful book or books, film, and artists, so we can sort of share new names and inspirations with the audience.
Okay. So for a book, I would say it's the travel of a scientist, Dr. Leonardo, and his future lover, beautiful Alcesta, to Slobodian, Switzerland. That is quite a mouthful of a name, but this novel by Mike Johansen is, uh, I would say, the best Ukrainian literature has to offer to a casual reader. It is really a highbrow text which requires tremendous erudition and education to decode, but it is at the same time not that deep. And you can apply all that erudition and education to decode that, only to realize there was nothing to decode in the first place. It is just a joke. The entire novel written as a joke, where the reader is aware since page one that it is a joke and nothing is to be taken seriously. And it is one of the most hilarious reading experiences I've had in my life. Granted, I have no idea if that thing will be funny for foreigners, or is it specifically insider Ukrainian thing that you need to spend some years here to understand.
Or
But
as good in translation. Well, the translation must be good because it's translated by William Blacker, who is a fabulous academic.
oh, so you
And
already found an English translation
I
of that.
found it. Yes, there's a
Great.
translation, and I know the guy who's translated it, and he's wonderful. And he's married to Elisa Khramyachuk, who's the head of the Ukrainian Institute, London. So
Nice.
I would estimate that this would be a fantastic book in translation, just as it is in the original.
I would say that is, well, for me, that was a transformative reading experience sometime around my second year in the university. I was not Ukrainian literature guy before that. I was more into English and French stuff. But after I read this book, I was shocked at how good that is. And so that is the Ukrainian book I would recommend anyone if you want to try something short, really easy read, something you can totally do before nighttime, and chances are you've never read anything like that before.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great recommendation there. Um, do you want to nominate any other books, or do we move on to film and
I
artist?
would say we move on because most other books I have in mind are much older and just not a good read to recommend to a casual reader.
Fantastic. And probably others in this project will be nominating them in any case. We've already had Misto by
Of
Valerian
course.
Pidnachil and yeah, all the usual sort of stuff. Yeah.
Well,
So,
I'm not surprised at all that Misto was the first, I guess, nominated, with its reputation of the first Ukrainian urban novel, with its being not the first Ukrainian urban novel is ironic. So, okay, I will recommend another one. I would say The Clouds by Nechuy Levitsky, which is a story about Ukrainian priests in the 19th century, about the old-fashioned and new-fashioned priests in Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which is a really funny novel on its own as well. But the humor is quite older, as the novel was written in some 1870s, I suppose. So it is a much older text, and it shows, I would say, expect more Dickensian style than modern reading.
excellent. Yes, another one I haven't heard of, but I'm adding that to the list of things to look up and become acquainted with. Let's turn then to film and artist.
Okay, for the film, there is no doubt. There are two films that must be recommended. One, because it is a must. When you are born in Ukraine, first thing you learn, it is obligatory. If anyone asks you what is the best Ukrainian movie, you answer Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors by Parajanov. There is no other way you answer to that question, even if you personally detest the movie, even if you cannot watch that, you still recommend it to any foreigner because you simply know that that is the best Ukraine has to offer, which is true to a degree, because it is not an easy movie to watch. It is not a clear movie to watch. More often than not, you will have no idea what is going on the screen. The sets will be beautiful, but you will have no idea what is going on the screen because I would say even as a Ukrainian, you have to have read the book to have a good idea, a good grasp of what is going on in the movie. The movie is beautiful and everything Parajanov shots is beautiful, but if you are not into really not just slow burn, movie, but just a slow movie, not much going on there. It is beautiful though. So if you are in for something like that, some kind of new wave movie from the 60s, which is gorgeous and really obscure, Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors. On the other hand, the movie everyone would actually recommend as the best Ukrainian movie if they had an opportunity. If we did not make the pinky promise to say Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors are the best. That is the movie I have no idea how to say in English. Let me Google that. Because I remember even writing an essay on this movie in my for my English class in the school, and I still had no idea how to translate that, and I believe I did not. I asked my teacher, and she had no idea how to translate that either. Okay, it's easier than I thought. The Lost Letter, it is called in English. I had trouble because it is called Propala Gramota in Ukrainian, and
Hmm.
Gramota is not just any kind of letter, it's a really official kind of letter, more of a state document.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so that gives you the political undertone of
Yeah.
the story from the get-go. This is an equranization, as many other films in Ukraine are just books put onto the screen. This one is a short story by Hohol, which was simply
Michal
put.
Hochel, or
Yeah,
as
yeah.
I read, people in the audience are going to know it. Of course, Nikolai Gogol are going to know the Russified version of his name.
So as I often say, Nikolai Gogol is the person who wrote Peterburg stories,
Hmm.
and Mykola Hohol is a person who wrote Mirgorod and Evenings
On a farm near Dikanka.
yeah.
Is that,
Oh,
yeah.
it is called farm in English. Okay, you got
Yeah.
me there.
Yeah.
Hutor is no farm at all in Ukrainian. I would not guess it in 100 years. Anyway,
Bad
anyway,
translation.
so The Lost Letter is one of the short stories of that first book of Hohol, which is hugely Ukrainian text. I mean, first two books by Hohol are basically Ukrainian literature, and then everything he wrote after that was Russian literature. That's how we count the guy.
Hmm.
And The Lost Letter is a story of a Ukrainian Cossack traveling to Petersburg, to St. Petersburg, to pass some kind of letter from his hetman to the Empress, which is Catherine the Terrible, or the Second, or the Great, whatever you call her. And so it is a comedy. I would say mystical comedy, fantasy comedy, but it is just surrealism comedy because all the cinema in Ukraine between 60s and 90s was either social realism or surrealism, and social realism was no good, really. So we are left with surrealism, which is called Ukrainian poetic cinema, but it is just weird. The Lost Letter is weird in all the best ways. It is full of memes, and it was memed into death in Ukraine. Like every single phrase from this movie is a meme in Ukraine right now. It will be a bit more obscure if you're not that familiar with Ukrainian culture, but still, it will be understandable. It is much easier movie to digest than Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors. And second part of that, which I really love a lot, it gives a great overview of Ukrainian folklore. I mean, folk songs, melodies, instruments, etc. Because, as it is said during Cossack era, the director made it filled with all the small details. And then the third movie, I will. Okay, I'm really doing that right now
Let's do a
because I
third one.
started
Let's do a
remembering.
third. Yeah.
The third movie to recommend here is, I would guess in English it should be called Two Birds with One Stone. In Ukrainian, it's За двома зайцями, Following Two Rabbits.
Mm.
And it is your normal, regular theater comedy. Adventurous comedy about a guy trying to marry two girls because one is beautiful and one is rich, and so he wants to make the best of two worlds. And but I would recommend seeing the movie to read in screenplay because the movie is a masterpiece of cinema of its time, of using props, of using practical effect, no, not practical effects per se, but using costumes, using everything that cinema has to offer. It's a great piece of art. It is really a serious vaudeville comedy, and
Mm.
at the same time it is a great piece of art. So these three, I would say, are the best Ukrainian cinema has to offer. Not talking about modern movies because those you can find on Netflix much easier and see for your own even as they come out.
And this was
Like,
made in 1961. Is this right? It's За двома зайцами. Is that,
yes,
have I got that?
yes.
Yeah, okay, great.
It was made in Ukrainian first, and then the Ukrainian version was lost, and everything that remained was Russian version. Even though many people started believing that Russian version is the original, though
Mm.
actors who were still alive said that they shot the entire thing in Ukrainian first, and they studio redubbed that into Russian. And then the only copy in existence of Ukrainian soundtrack for the movie was found in a cinema hall in Mariupol, of all places, some half a year before the invasion. It was luckily evacuated to Kyiv. It was digitalized, and digital copy is now available, I believe, even on YouTube for free. But of course, you have to speak Ukrainian for that. But there should be subbed version somewhere, and this is truly great movie with even greater history. And the fact that we managed to reclaim the original project is great.
just that the irony there, just before the literal erasure of Mariupol and whatever Ukrainian heritage might have been, still extant there. I guess anything that wasn't discovered prior to that date is now lost, potentially, even when the city is reclaimed.
Yeah, but right now, if you are somewhere around the cinema and you see the movie You Are the Universe showing there anywhere, that is the most contemporary Ukrainian movie to watch. And we all agree that is one of the best we've done in decades. I mean, it is not just a solid movie, I would say it is a great movie.
Hmm.
One of the few we had in last decades. This one is great, but it is too fresh to recommend in that capacity. We don't know what the cultural impact would be. But if it is showing somewhere around you, I recommend you go and watch it. It is a great story.
Worth having a look, definitely. Well, now we're on to the last question, and that is work of art or artist.
Work of art or artist, that is a tough one because
Now, we've already had
so
Repin,
many
we've already
people.
had Maria Primichenko, just to sort of put the context there. And who else have we had? We have had, let's have a look. Um, Alexander Marashka.
Mm, or makes sense. I can think of several more people like Bohomazov who will be definitely mentioned later on. Murashko was my second call, I would
Mm,
say, because Murashko is a famous one and I love him. Uh, okay, I would name two people. One of them is Gniezdowski, because Yakov Gniezdowski is simply a great artist. I've been to his exhibitions. We used oh no, that was not him. It was Krichevsky. Still, Krichevsky is great as well, but slightly different area. Still, Yakov Gniezdowski. And the second one would be Valentin Kolontai, who is similar to Gniezdowski in many regards. Their kind of art, the modus of creating art looks similar. Kolontai is a contemporary, of course, while Gniezdowski being of 20th century. Kolontai was lost in action in 2023, if I remember correctly. He was a friend of mine, not that famous of an artist, though he was famous. And his booth at Book Arsenal was a popular place to go for some postcards, etc., which he did from his larger paintings. A great artist he was, and he's still counted lost as far as I'm aware. So no confirmation of death, but no one heard of him since then. And the second one of the same kind would be David Chichkan. I would say the most famous anarchist in Ukrainian army. The guy with a dream to create a leftist, like mostly anarchist battalion or platoon or whatever kind of scope or size in Ukrainian army, a leftist unit which will
mm,
be separate from everyone else by political agenda. But for him, it was about all the anarchists and all the leftist guys who can realize the historical necessity of having a state, of having a Ukrainian state to be a Ukrainian anarchist. And this kind of philosophy he ended up with that a state must exist for you to be an anarchist in the first place and to for you to be subversive towards it. I love his art. I love how his art is subversive of the state at the same time as he defended that state and defended it with his life. He is one of the heroes of this war to me and a great artist. We did a little tribute to him this year on Book State, which is a book fair in Kyiv. We were doing an exhibition of military artists, and I knew David, I knew his art. I wanted him there before he died, of course. And I received news of his death just the day I was supposed to call him about his works. So we postponed it for some weeks to pay our respects and say goodbye. And then via his wife, we obtained some works, and we made that tribute to David in our space. So these two, I would say, are the most important for me personally. Uh, and they are worth talking about, not because they are dead, but unfortunately, the reason they are the first I remember of when talking about contemporary Ukrainian artists, the reason for that is because they are dead, and the only place I ever meet them is in my mind. That's how they pop up all the time.
That's a poignant place to finish there, especially people whose creative life has been cut short, which unfortunately is a common feature of Ukrainian artists and writers in history. Ostap, absolutely delighted to have this conversation again and to share such a brilliant set of works with the audience. And hopefully we'll get some comments that people have followed up on this, and I'd love to hear their comments around it. But for now, though, I'd like to say thank you for the work you do, especially as part of the cultural forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, and for being such a great comrade in the fight against Russian disinformation and propaganda. Thanks so much for coming back on.
Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure talking to you as always, and hope to see you soon.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself.
I'm going to the war just because I want to protect my family now and my future family, my future children's.
It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.